April 8, 1943. 27,000 feet above Caen, France. Oberleutnant Ralph Hermachin scanned the sky and saw them for the first time. Fat, ungainly, absurd. The new American fighters looked like flying milk bottles with tiny wings strapped to barrel-shaped bodies. German pilots in their sleek Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts actually laughed over the radio. These things were supposed to fight. The Luftwaffe veterans, battle-hardened from years of combat, felt almost insulted. But inside each of those ridiculous-looking aircraft sat 8 Browning M2 machine guns, 50 caliber, 6,000 rounds per minute combined. And in less than 2 years, those laughing German pilots would be calling the P-47 Thunderbolt the most terrifying thing in the sky. The joke was about to become their nightmare. The Americans had built something that made no sense by European standards. While German engineers obsessed over lightweight, agile interceptors that could twist and turn like angry hornets, Republic Aviation's Alexander Kartveli designed what looked like a flying tank. 10,000 pounds empty. That's heavier than some twin-engine fighters fully loaded. A Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine pumping out 2,000 horsepower, more power than entire bomber formations from just a decade earlier. And those 8 guns. But here's what nobody expected. The P-47 couldn't dogfight worth a damn. Early encounters proved the German mockery wasn't entirely wrong. The Thunderbolt turned like a truck, climbed slower than its enemies, and at medium altitudes, the Focke-Wulf 190 danced circles around it. The initial kill ratios heavily favored the Luftwaffe. American pilots were dying. Training accidents piled up as inexperienced flyers struggled with ground looping and compressibility issues. The P-47 seemed like an expensive mistake wrapped in aluminum. German intelligence reports dismissed it as a minor threat. Just another overpowered American brute that would fall apart under real combat pressure. But then something started happening that nobody could explain. P-47s came back. Not just came back, but came back from missions that should have been death sentences. Planes riddled with cannon holes, control surfaces shredded, hydraulics leaking, engines smoking, and yet they kept flying. June 26, 1943, changed everything. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson's Thunderbolt got ambushed. A German ace named Egon Meyer pumped round after round into Johnson's aircraft. The canopy shattered. The fuselage looked like Swiss cheese. Any other fighter would have disintegrated. Johnson couldn't bail out. His canopy was jammed. So he just kept flying. The German pilot pulled alongside, probably expecting to watch the American spiral down. Instead, Johnson's P-47 just absorbed the punishment and refused to die. He made it home. When mechanics counted the damage, they stopped at 200 holes. The radial engine's ruggedness, the absence of vulnerable liquid cooling systems, the sheer overbuilt nature of every component meant the Thunderbolt could take beatings that would doom anything else in the sky. And suddenly, American pilots realized they weren't flying a fighter. They were flying a flying fortress with guns pointed forward. Those 850 caliber machine guns created something the Luftwaffe had never encountered. 30 seconds of continuous fire. In European air combat, that was unheard of. German cannons packed devastating punch but carried maybe 120 to 200 rounds total. Precision was mandatory. The P-47 carried 3,400 rounds, 425 rounds per gun. American pilots could hold the trigger and just spray a cone of death. And they learned how to use it. By July 1943, tactics shifted. Forget turning fights. The P-47's strengths lay elsewhere. Climb above 30,000 feet, where the turbo-supercharged engine still pumped full power while German fighters gasped for air. Spot an enemy below. Dive. 550 miles per hour in a screaming vertical attack that no German aircraft could match. Deliver a 2-second burst, 20 rounds minimum hitting the target, then zoom back up to altitude before the enemy could react. Boom and zoom. The Thunderbolt's weaknesses became irrelevant when it fought on its own terms, and German pilots started dying. August 17, 1943, the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids. P-47s encountered Messerschmitt Bf-110 twin-engine fighters trying to break through to the bombers. 8 Bf-110s destroyed in under 60 seconds. The concentrated firepower was apocalyptic. German gunners couldn't withstand it. The ammunition itself was engineered for maximum lethality. Armor-piercing rounds mixed with incendiaries burning at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Not just punching holes, but setting aluminum airframes on fire from the inside. The probability mathematics were brutal. Even mediocre aim created a cloud of bullets that guaranteed hits. While German pilots carefully lined up cannon shots, P-47 pilots just pointed in the general direction and squeezed. Volume of fire became deadlier than precision, and the psychological effect was shattering. Luftwaffe pilots reported hearing the 8 guns firing created a distinctive roar, a sound that meant you had maybe 2 seconds before your aircraft came apart. September arrived, and with it came a new horror for the Germans: high-altitude performance. The Thunderbolt's turbo-supercharger allowed full power above 30,000 feet, 42,000 feet ceiling. German fighters suffered massive performance drops at those altitudes, engines starving, controls sluggish. The P-47 owned the high sky. October 8, 1943. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, a top German ace, veteran of hundreds of missions, went down, killed by a Thunderbolt at altitude where his Focke-Wulf couldn't maneuver. German intelligence reports changed tone dramatically. Suddenly, the flying milk bottle was classified as a critical threat. Then came the P-47 D-22 variant with its paddle blade propeller. Climb rate jumped from 2,200 feet per minute to 3,000. Acceleration improved across the board. The performance gap closed. German pilots who'd relied on outclimbing the Americans suddenly found these fat fighters keeping pace. That propeller created another signature, a thunderclap sound audible from miles away. Ground troops heard it and dove for cover. Pilots heard it and knew death was close. With external fuel tanks, the P-47's range extended past 1,000 miles. Early 1944, Thunderbolts escorted bombers deep into Germany. The Luftwaffe tried to break through. They paid in blood. Formations of P-47s, experienced pilots with hundreds of training hours, overwhelmed German attacks. The Americans had pilots, 30,000 trained annually by 1944. Germany's entire war output was less. American P-47 pilots averaged over 400 hours of training before combat. Germans were going up with less than 100 by war's end. It wasn't even a fair fight anymore. Then the P-47 evolved again. As P-51 Mustangs took over long-range escort duties in mid-1944, Thunderbolts transitioned to something even more devastating: ground attack. Those 8 machine guns that shredded aircraft in the sky now pointed at tanks, trucks, trains, anything that moved on German roads. 2-second burst. 160 half-inch projectiles into a truck-sized target. Complete annihilation. Add bombs. 2,500 pounds worth. Add rockets. 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets. The Thunderbolt became a flying artillery battery. German ground troops created a new term: Jabo fever. Acute stress symptoms before missions where P-47s operated. Panicked at the sound of that thunderclap. D-Day, June 6, 1944. Over 500 P-47s created an impenetrable air cover. Luftwaffe fighters attempting to reach the beaches got massacred. The few that survived reported walls of tracers, aircraft exploding before they could even locate targets. Utter chaos. June 1944. Statistics from the 9th Air Force told the story. Thousands of German vehicles destroyed, locomotives blown apart, the Wehrmacht reduced to moving only at night because daylight meant death from above. German armour, reinforced against ground fire, proved useless against 50 caliber rounds punching through engine blocks and ammunition stores. Even the feared 88mm flak guns struggled to track the low-flying Thunderbolts screaming past at 300 miles per hour. The industrial capacity behind the P-47 was something Germany simply couldn't comprehend. Republic Aviation and other factories produced 15,683 P-47s during the war. One aircraft every hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at peak production. The Evansville plant alone built 500 per month in 1944. Each aircraft required 65,000 individual parts, 8 miles of electrical wiring, 2,000 pounds of aluminum, 300 pounds of rubber. When the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte on January 1, 1945, a surprise attack destroying 22 P-47s at one airfield, the American response was swift and crushing. Aircraft replaced within days. The Germans lost 271 aircraft and 213 irreplaceable pilots in that operation. Losses they could never recover from. The Americans just built more. Ammunition consumption was staggering. Each sortie burned through 3,400 rounds. By mid-1944, monthly consumption exceeded 10 million rounds. Lake City Arsenal produced 30 million rounds monthly, each machined to microscopic tolerances. Fuel consumption was equally massive. Each P-47 burned 100 gallons per hour in normal flight, up to 300 with water injection in combat. The 9th Air Force alone consumed over 25 million gallons of aviation fuel monthly by late 1944. All shipped across the Atlantic, all delivered. The logistics were as devastating as the weapons themselves. Even German jets couldn't escape. The Messerschmitt Me-262, faster than anything in the sky at high speed, still had to take off and land. P-47 pilots learned to loiter near Luftwaffe airfields, waiting for jets at their most vulnerable. November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meare caught a Me-262 in a dive, matched its speed using gravity, and shredded it with those 850s. Specialized P-47M variants pushed speeds to 470 miles per hour at altitude using water methanol injection, built specifically to chase V-1 flying bombs and intercept jets. The engineering margins were absurd. Wing spars rated for 40,000 pounds, 3 times the aircraft's loaded weight. Engine mounts designed to survive 12G forces. Control cables doubled with automatic backups. The ammunition feed system was a mechanical masterpiece with 8 separate ammo boxes feeding guns via electric boost motors to prevent jamming at high altitude. Each gun independently heated against freezing, independently charged and synchronized. Gun convergence adjustable from 150 to 400 yards for tactical flexibility. German engineers examining captured P-47s were stunned at the over-engineering. This wasn't a fighter. This was a statement about industrial superiority. The final statistics are almost incomprehensible. In Europe alone, 3,752 German aircraft destroyed in air combat, another 3,315 on the ground, 86,000 railway cars obliterated, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armoured vehicles, 68,000 trucks, 60,000 horse-drawn vehicles. The 9th Air Force flew 213,873 combat sorties, dropped 120,000 tons of bombs, fired 135 million rounds, launched 60,000 rockets. Kill ratio, 4.6 to 1 in aerial combat. Lowest loss rate among Allied fighter bombers despite flying the most dangerous missions. In the Pacific, P-47s destroyed 697 Japanese aircraft in air combat, terrorizing enemy pilots who called them monsters for their refusal to die. The P-47N variant with wet wings extended range to 2,350 miles, escorting B-29s all the way to Japan. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe was effectively finished, not because they ran out of courage or skill, but because they ran out of fuel, pilots, and hope. Surviving German flyers faced overwhelming P-47 formations at every altitude. The psychological impact was total. Jabo fever wasn't just stress, it was recognition of futility. German intelligence assessments tell the transformation story perfectly. April 1943. Large, unmaneuverable, inferior except dive speed, minimal threat. December 1943. Exceptional high-altitude performance, significant threat above 25,000 feet. June 1944. Dominant fighter bomber, devastating firepower, critical threat at all altitudes. March 1945. Best fighter bomber operational, unmatched firepower and durability, pilot quality exceptional, direct engagement inadvisable. In a 1945 interview, Oberleutnant Josef Priller, who once mocked the P-47, admitted everything. The Thunderbolt's unprecedented firepower, its indestructibility, the unlimited American production capacity destroyed any chance Germany had. General Adolf Galland, former head of Luftwaffe fighter forces, went further in post-war reflection. The Germans designed fighters for European-style dogfighting elegance. The Americans designed a fighter for industrial warfare, production, survivability, firepower. Over 15,000 units during a two-ocean war. The distinct sound of 850 caliber machine guns, nicknamed Roosevelt's piano by terrified German soldiers, became the audio signature of Allied air dominance. A captured German pilot, interviewed after the war, summed it up with brutal honesty. At first we laughed. That fat American fighter looked ridiculous. Then we fought them. The laughter stopped. They just pointed those guns at you and you ceased to exist. The P-47 Thunderbolt didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe tactically, it broke them industrially, psychologically, and operationally. It proved that in modern warfare, the combination of engineering excellence, industrial capacity, and tactical innovation beats traditional fighter virtues every time. Those German pilots who laughed in April 1943 learned the hardest lesson in aviation history. Never underestimate 850 caliber machine guns in the hands of pilots who have unlimited ammunition, unlimited fuel, and unlimited replacement aircraft. The joke wasn't funny anymore. It was the sound of an entire air force being erased from the sky. The engineering philosophy behind the P-47 represented a fundamental shift in how America approached aerial warfare. While European designers obsessed over shaving pounds to gain fractions of a second in turn time, Republic Aviation went the opposite direction. Make it stronger, make it heavier, make it survive. The result was an aircraft that redefined what acceptable losses meant. Other fighters went down after a few hits. The P-47 absorbed hundreds and kept fighting. Mechanics told stories of aircraft returning with cylinder heads blown off the radial engine, still running on remaining cylinders. Control surfaces held together by a few cables, yet still responsive. Fuel tanks punctured in multiple places. Self-sealing foam preventing catastrophic fires. The ruggedness wasn't accidental. Every system had redundancy. Every component exceeded minimum specifications by massive margins. This wasn't just engineering caution. This was designed recognition that industrial war meant attrition, and the side whose equipment lasted longer would win. The firepower philosophy was equally revolutionary. German and British fighters mounting 20mm or 30mm cannons seemed superior on paper. Heavier projectiles, explosive warheads, devastating single-hit potential. But combat revealed brutal truth. Cannons required precise aim and carried limited ammunition. A skilled German pilot might get 2 or 3 good bursts per mission before running dry. The P-47 pilot could hold the trigger for 30 seconds straight. Precision became optional when you filled the sky with lead. American ammunition development reflected this philosophy. Each 50 caliber round was a small masterpiece of engineering. Armor-piercing cores, tungsten carbide hardened. Incendiary compounds designed to ignite at impact. Delayed action fuses, allowing penetration before detonation. Tracer rounds every fifth bullet for aim correction. The psychological effect of seeing hundreds of tracers converging was immense. German pilots described it as flying into a wall of light that meant instant death. Training made the difference between a good weapon and an unstoppable one. By 1944, American pilot training was an industrial process as refined as aircraft production. 400 hours minimum before combat deployment. 100 hours in advanced fighters. Rigorous gunnery training with thousands of practice rounds fired. Tactical instruction covering enemy aircraft recognition, evasive maneuvers, formation discipline, boom and zoom execution. Survival training for bailouts over enemy territory. Radio procedure drills, night flying qualification, instrument flight in all weather. The result was pilots who knew their aircraft intimately and understood exactly how to exploit its advantages. German pilots by late war were launching into combat with barely enough hours to master takeoffs and landings. They faced Americans who could push the P-47 to its absolute limits, who knew every quirk of the turbo-supercharger, who could calculate intercept angles instinctively, who worked as coordinated teams rather than individual hunters. The ground attack role transformed the P-47 from air superiority fighter into something far more strategically devastating. German military mobility depended on roads and railways. The Thunderbolt systematically destroyed both. Locomotive boilers exploded under 50 caliber fire. Railway cars carrying ammunition detonated in chain reactions. Fuel trucks became fireballs. Tank columns caught in the open-faced aircraft that could pump 160 rounds into them in 2 seconds, penetrating engine decks and ammunition storage, brewing up armor that was supposed to be invulnerable from above. The rockets added another dimension. 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets carried 60 pounds of high explosive each. 10 rockets per aircraft. A 4-plane flight could deliver 2,400 pounds of rockets plus 10,000 pounds of bombs in a single pass. The devastation was comprehensive. German after-action reports from Normandy describe entire convoys annihilated, roads cratered and impassable, movement during daylight hours effectively impossible. The psychological warfare aspect was unintentional but catastrophic for German morale. The sound of approaching P-47s created panic. That distinctive thunder of the paddle blade propeller, the roar of 8 machine guns, became Pavlovian triggers for terror. German soldiers developed acute stress responses, diving for cover at engine sounds that weren't even aircraft. Jabo fever manifested as tremors, inability to sleep, refusal to leave covered positions even when no aircraft were present. Luftwaffe pilots exhibited similar symptoms. Some experienced pilots refused missions when they learned P-47s were operating in the area. Not cowardice, rational calculation that survival was impossible. The few who engaged and survived described combat as surreal nightmares where nothing worked. Altitude advantage negated by the Thunderbolt's turbo-supercharger. Speed advantage non-existent against dive performance. Firepower completely one-sided. Armor inadequate against 50 caliber penetration. Even tactical victories felt hollow because Americans replaced losses faster than Germans could inflict them. The Pacific Theater revealed another dimension of P-47 versatility. Japanese aircraft design philosophy emphasized extreme lightness and maneuverability at the cost of protection and firepower. Against the Thunderbolt, this was suicide. Japanese pilots flying Zeros and Oscars found their traditional advantages meaningless. The P-47 simply refused to engage in turning fights. Instead, American pilots used altitude and dive speed, exactly like in Europe. But the psychological impact was even more severe. Japanese pilots called the P-47 monsters, not just for firepower, but for seeming invulnerability. Their 7.7mm and even 20mm weapons seemed ineffective. Stories spread of P-47s absorbing dozens of hits and continuing attacks. The P-47N variant's extended range meant Thunderbolts could escort B-29s on the longest bombing missions in history, from Iwo Jima and Saipan all the way to Japanese home islands, over 1,500 miles one way. The presence of P-47 escorts destroyed Japanese interceptor effectiveness, allowing strategic bombing to proceed with minimal losses. The logistics behind keeping P-47 operations running were as impressive as the aircraft itself. Every sortie required coordination of dozens of support personnel. Armament crews loading 3,400 rounds of ammunition, each round inspected for defects. Fueling crews pumping hundreds of gallons, checking for water contamination. Mechanics performing pre-flight inspections on 65,000 individual components. Radio technicians verifying communication systems. Oxygen system checks for high-altitude operations. Engine specialists monitoring the complex turbo-supercharger system. Intelligence officers briefing targets and expected enemy activity. Weather forecasters providing route conditions. All of this happening simultaneously across dozens of airfields, hundreds of aircraft, thousands of sorties daily. The American ability to maintain this tempo month after month, year after year, while simultaneously conducting naval operations across the Pacific and ground campaigns in Europe, demonstrated industrial and organizational capacity that Germany simply couldn't match. The P-47 was the visible weapon. The invisible weapon was the system that kept it flying. Post-war analysis by military historians consistently ranks the P-47 among the most cost-effective weapons systems of World War II. Not because it was cheap. Each aircraft cost around $85,000, expensive for fighters of that era. But because of mission effectiveness, survivability, and versatility. The same aircraft that destroyed Luftwaffe fighters at 30,000 feet over Berlin could strafe German trucks in France the next day, then transition to escorting bombers over Japan the week after. Multi-role capability before the term existed. The low loss rate meant experienced pilots survived to train new ones, creating multiplicative effectiveness. Each veteran P-47 pilot became a teacher, spreading tactical knowledge through squadrons. German pilots died at unsustainable rates, taking their expertise with them. The arithmetic was brutal but simple. Americans learned from their mistakes and improved. Germans repeated the same mistakes with increasingly inexperienced pilots until there was nobody left. The final indignity for the Luftwaffe came in the war's last months. By March 1945, German synthetic fuel production had collapsed under Allied bombing. Aircraft sat on runways without fuel. When fuel was available, qualified pilots weren't. When pilots were available, aircraft weren't. The few operational sorties faced overwhelming Allied air superiority at every altitude. P-47 formations, sometimes 100 aircraft strong, patrolled German airspace unopposed. German pilots who did take off described it as flying into certain death. The Americans had everything: altitude, speed, firepower, numbers, experience, fuel, ammunition, replacement aircraft. The Luftwaffe had nothing but desperation. Some German pilots genuinely believed the P-47 pilots could see through clouds and darkness. Such was their effectiveness at intercepting any German air activity. The reality was less mystical. Radar guidance, massive numbers, and systematic patrol patterns meant nowhere was safe. The psychological superiority was total. General Adolf Galland's post-war assessment remains the most damning indictment of German fighter design philosophy. He acknowledged that the Luftwaffe designed beautiful, elegant fighters optimized for pilot skill and tactical brilliance. The Americans designed ugly, brutal fighters optimized for industrial war. When pilot skill was equal, the P-47 won on firepower. When Germans had skill advantage, Americans won on numbers. When Germans had tactical position, Americans won on dive speed. There was no scenario where Luftwaffe advantages could overcome Thunderbolt systematic superiority. Galland specifically praised the P-47's cockpit comfort, noting that American pilots fought from what felt like armored lounges with excellent visibility, ergonomic controls, and heating systems that actually worked. German pilots sat in cramped cockpits with poor rearward visibility, freezing at altitude, struggling with controls that required physical strength to manipulate. Comfort affected combat effectiveness. Fatigued, cold, uncomfortable pilots made mistakes. Fresh, comfortable American pilots maintained peak performance throughout long missions. The legacy of the P-47 extends beyond World War II statistics. It established design principles that influenced every American fighter aircraft since: survivability over agility, firepower over elegance, multi-role capability over specialized optimization. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, direct spiritual successor, carries the same philosophy into modern era: massive firepower, exceptional durability, ground attack excellence. The F-15 and F-16 design competitions debated similar questions: light fighter versus heavy fighter, agility versus systems, and ultimately American doctrine chose both. But the P-47 proved the fundamental concept. In industrial warfare, the side that builds robust, versatile, survivable weapons in overwhelming numbers wins. Individual aircraft quality matters less than systemic superiority. The Germans built masterpieces. The Americans built functional tools and mass-produced them. The tools won because there were always more tools, always more ammunition, always more fuel, always more pilots. Standing before a P-47 in a museum today, it still looks oversized and ungainly. That massive radial engine, the barrel-shaped fuselage, those 8 machine gun ports in the wings. It doesn't look fast or agile, it looks blunt and brutal. Which is exactly what it was: a flying embodiment of American industrial warfare doctrine. Point it at the enemy, pull the trigger. Repeat until the enemy ceases to exist. The German pilots who laughed in April 1943 learned that lesson the hardest way possible. By April 1945, there weren't enough left to laugh at anything. The P-47 Thunderbolt and its 850 caliber machine guns had written the final chapter of the Luftwaffe, not through elegance or tactical genius, but through sheer, overwhelming application of firepower backed by industrial capacity that Germany could never match. The ultimate joke was this: what looked ridiculous won the war.